A powerful demon fought a girl named Charlotte Elena. She seemed to have no chance of success, and even her companions advised her to retreat, given that the protagonist was already weakened and wounded. It would be unwise for her to resort to magic again. However, the young woman herself was disinclined to leave the battlefield, for that would mean the inevitable death of all who came with her. That is why Charlotte decided to take the risk and was able to achieve the desired victory before his demise. The demon promised to return and consume whoever killed him, but the conflict ended, and the protagonist became famous, rising to the rank of supreme mage. On that fateful day, however, she lost one eye. Later, when things subsided, the girl's teacher pretended to be ill, pretending that her end was near, and expressed her final wish that Charlotte find 5 students. Since her life would be full of dangers, it was better not to try to endure everything alone, but to have someone strong by her side. Alternatively, the teacher wanted his student to lead a normal life and start a family. The young woman doubted her ability to mentor others or find the right people, but she seriously considered her teacher's words. Much time has passed since then, and Charlotte Elena has developed her magical abilities and reached great heights. Even her students have been recognized as wonderful children. Despite her immense power, the main characters remained human, and thus her life was limited. Thus, the girl arrived at a secluded place where a prepared tomb awaited. Charlotte was proud of her students, but she also had misgivings about them. Although her time had long passed, the heroine lived for over 100 years, but her students could not realize this reality because of the special magic that kept her body young for long periods of time. In her last moments, Charlotte decided to release her magic into the world so that it could serve to help the earth and its people, and so the end came. All of the protagonist's students received a letter with her last will and testament. Thus, Charlotte was left with no regrets for anything but her unfulfilled desire to experience the love that had eluded her. Nevertheless, Magus lived a good life. Each of her students received a letter from her in a special way, even though they were in very different places and circumstances. When Charlotte already believed that she was already dead, she suddenly opened her eyes and realized that she had become a child. The main characters couldn't figure out what had happened. Her last spell had worked, and the essence had left her being. However, why did she survive and, moreover, why is she now in a strange form? It took Charlotte a few moments to realize that she had become a child. Suddenly she remembered her teacher's words about magic and the profound influence of human desires on her. All of this seems to have been due to the mild remorse that had accompanied the girl throughout her life. At the same time, the subjects of the Archduke Geoffrey Thane Leicester were sorting through letters addressed to their lord, confessing their love to him. This seemed extremely unusual to them, considering that recently even a young girl had shown up to express her love to the Duke in person, though of course she was unable to get an audience with the man outside. Charlotte was looking for a magic store, as she had nothing now and needed to sell her things to get money. The girl asked for directions from a passerby, but spoke to him as if she were much older than she really was. Although the man found this rather odd, he decided to help her. As soon as the passerby finished speaking, the door of one of the buildings crushed him. A fierce battle erupted between the knight and the mage, with the former believing the archmage Charlotte Elena was nothing, and the latter, by contrast, admiring her and considering her to be the most powerful person in the Marvel Empire. At first the protagonist stood by, but eventually ordered both fighters to stop, using a method that made the money obey her order. The stunned crowd whispered among themselves, while Knight, gripped by great anger, realized that magic had been used against him, which he despised. Suddenly, in the midst of the noise, the Duke appeared. He was trying to understand the reason for this disturbance. The knight, on the other hand, sought the Duke's opinion of the archmage, but, not getting a clear answer, began to insult Charlotte, assuming that Geoffrey would agree with him. Archiduke, however, only dismissed the lowly warrior, banishing him from his lands. The protagonist intervened again, this time grabbing the Duke's cloak. He recognized the archmage at once, for he was attracted by Charlotte's magic. He was horrified, however, to find the most powerful mage in such miserable condition. The Duke escorted the protagonist to a clothing store. She could no longer bear the weight of exorbitant clothes, and one of the dresses fit her. The Duke ordered her to try on various models, but she was unwilling to linger among the clothes for too long. The gentleman was eager to see the archmage in charming clothes. Charlotte refused to tolerate it and quickly put an end to the trying on. Once the protagonist was alone with Geoffrey, he immediately begged her to tell him everything that had happened, for such a situation could not have been an accident. However, he was unhappy with the truth. Charlotte intended to die without even saying goodbye to her friends. This revelation deeply shook the man, causing him to shed tears, and he even decided to die beside the archmage the next time she decided to go that route. The protagonist had the unfortunate habit of carrying the burden of life alone, even though his best friend Geoffrey was by his side. At this point, he needed a friend's help. She was starting a new life, not as an archmage or a celebrity, but as an ordinary person. The archmage decided to start a conversation with his friend by watching his speech, as it did not resemble that of a child. Meanwhile, one of the main character's students arrived at the place where Charlotte intended to commit suicide. Realizing that the girl was not there, he was determined to find the teacher regardless of any obstacles. At this point, Geoffrey brought one of his servants to the archmage and instructed him to share his story. Eventually turned out to be the right choice to guard the girl, and they found her a new identity. Henceforth, she would become the daughter of an earl in a tranquil realm, to be known as Aria. Later, in her new retreat, the girl met two twins and called them babies, though they were older than her, which surprised them greatly. Geoffrey also worried that Charlotte had no intention of informing her students of her survival, but she remained steadfast in her decision. They had undoubtedly received her letters, so it was better for her to remain dead in their eyes. That way they would become more independent and stop relying on their teacher for everything. It would be impossible to find her because of the lack of traces left behind. However, she was wrong, and by evening one of the main character's students shows up in the Duke's room. This student turns out to be Evan, and he demands that the Duke tell him where Charlotte is. However, the man pretends not to know what has happened to the girl and where she may be now. He also tries to get rid of Evan as quickly as possible, since they broke into his manor uninvited. He even pulls out his sword, preparing for battle, when two more apprentice mages show up. Only then does Geoffrey realize that he has no chance. However, the guests begin to argue amongst themselves, and Dan grabs Evan by the collar, eager to reveal the truth as he was with Charlotte until the very end. Only the third student realizes that no one here knows the archmage's whereabouts. Geoffrey also maintains a semblance of unease so that the visitors do not suspect anything. And so it happens that the students decide to question other acquaintances of their teacher, not believing Charlotte's death, and set out to find other places where the archmage might have been hiding. First, they plan to follow her trail from the Marvel Empire. The Duke's cell was left in a terrible state after this encounter. The next morning, one of his subjects entered and was outraged by the mess. However, given the clash with the three great mages, it wasn't all that bad. However, since Charlotte was almost revealed, one must be careful and avoid meeting the girl. Meanwhile, the archmage herself was delighted with the cake with the twins. They had a playful argument over an extra piece, which led Charlotte to give her share to the girl to appease them. Eventually, a boy named Jerome, not wanting to deprive the Earl's daughter of a treat, handed his share to the main characters. The child tried to talk to the protagonist as a friend, at which point she realized that she really should live like a normal person, since she had made that decision. In this way, Charlotte found it easier to communicate with children to find the love she dreamed of. The girl realized that she needed to become an adult first. 8 years passed, the protagonist grew up and was now a young man, whom she had only met a few times, offered her marriage. However, the girl did not immediately remember who he was, and, moreover, she thought he was just a child compared to herself. These thoughts troubled her, implying that she might not experience love even in this life. Rejecting the boy, she ran away to the twins, who were eagerly waiting for their friend. Observing them was a stranger in a hooded cloak. In the capital of the Empire Claws, where the protagonist was located, an unknown girl seeks refuge from her pursuers. She hides behind large crates, hoping they won't find her, but eventually they do surround her, leaving her with nowhere to run. At Lulu's Cultivation Club, the session is due to begin, and the twins are already there. The plant they need to grow was recently invented by a wizard from Marvel, and its special feature is that the petals change color depending on the wearer's mood, and in rare cases, if the petals turn bright red, the flower owner will soon find love. This makes Charlotte think about her own regrets. After the session, Judith convinces the protagonist and her brother to take a walk around the capital. The archmage wasn't particularly happy with this development, but the girl was determined to spend the day in an eventful way. Suddenly, the children realize that they are being followed. It turns out to be Fading, who is hiding under a cloak and hood for reasons that are unclear. In fact, he has been assigned to arrange a meeting between the girl and Geoffrey. The Duke's van was already waiting nearby, and the protagonist calmly stepped into it. The man was holding a magnificent bouquet of flowers, although he did not openly admit that he bought them for Charlotte. He offered her the bouquet, but the protagonist naturally refused. She didn't even notice the direct hints. Geoffrey was practically demanding her attention as his potential mate. Even the captain, who died of old age several years ago, seemed like a more attractive option to her. The archmage was worried about the well-being of her students, but the man assured her that all was as good in Marvel as it was here, that they were quite well off. In fact, the squad of the night pursued Dan. They surrounded him and ordered him to surrender, but he simply disappeared, marveling at the stupidity of the warriors. Meanwhile, Charlotte had already returned to the twins when it turned out that Judith had forgotten her gloves when they were planting flowers. Since they were a valuable item, they had to be retrieved. The protagonist decided to go alone, taking the opportunity to reflect on her thoughts. As soon as the girl left, the guards rushed past her brother and sister, still looking for Dan. They accused him of kidnapping, though the alleged culprit himself was standing right where the flower planting session was taking place. There he met the main characters. To conceal the girl's identity, she took refuge under a cloak and tried to leave the place. However, the servants did not want to let her go so easily and consequently chased after her. Fortunately, they were unable to ascertain the protagonist's identity before she disappeared from view. Upon returning to the twins, Charlotte fixed her cloak, but her hair remained disheveled, causing anxiety to the children. They feared that kidnappers might have happened to the girl, so they quickly briefed her on everything that was going on. The archmage was furious that her apprentice had been caught up in such terrible affairs. It was hard to believe such a thing. Dan couldn't control his abilities from an early age, so he was deeply concerned that someone might get hurt. He was always afraid and tried to hide in a corner, even though others despised him. Later, when the twins were playing, the protagonist decided to question the butler about his knowledge of kidnapping. Although she learned nothing new, Geoffrey's silence made her suspicious. The Duke could not have been unaware of what was going on. Charlotte decided to investigate in person at night, when everyone had long since fallen asleep. The girl pulled herself together and crawled out the window into the city. There she noticed the increased number of guards in the streets and noticed the knights lying on the ground in an alley. As she got closer, she immediately heard the voices of the kidnappers and witnessed the actual kidnapping. They frightened the man so badly that he lost consciousness. His description matched that of the kidnappers, and he looked like an archmage. A mysterious woman, completely inconsistent with the description, was hiding around the corner. The kidnappers were contemplating how to get rid of the witness, but heard Charlotte's voice come from behind. She was enraged at the boys and even punched one of them in the face as their actions were completely contrary to her teachings. The young woman immediately recognized the leader of the organization, who was under Dan's command. If the leader himself is involved, it means that the order was given personally by the student of the protagonist. Charlotte decided to surrender and offered to be kidnapped herself, though not immediately. The kidnappers realized that the girl in front of them fit their description perfectly, so they accepted her offer and took the main character with them. Upon arrival, it appeared that all of the kidnapped people were sitting quietly at the table, drinking tea. No one had been harmed, and they did not look frightened. Moreover, many of them had boosted their self-esteem. The same people Charlotte had seen outside entered the room. They promised to treat the guests well, citing the example that no one would harm their pet. Everyone present was asked to stand in line, each one approaching Dan, who looked unwell, even though his mana was fine. He tried to put a bandage on the main character for each guest and let them all go, since no one resembled his teacher. Surprisingly, when it was Charlotte's turn, he didn't even try to put a blindfold on her and let her go right away, which surprised even the kidnappers, since the girl fit the description perfectly. In the end, Dan called one of the older men his teacher and simply let the others go and rewarded them generously. This hurt the protagonist a bit, as this man was completely unlike her. Nevertheless, she quietly walked away. One of the members explained the reason for their actions to the protagonist. Dan hadn't been able to sleep well for a long time because he missed the stories his teacher told him. So he resorted to kidnapping people who fit the description. They would spend time sharing stories with the magician, and then leave with a reward. This revelation made Charlotte think about her other students. She runs as fast as she can, picking up every possible rumor. As it turns out, all of them were or are still in danger in one way or another. One of them even died. Then Charlotte realizes that she should have heard about this much earlier, but it seems that every effort has been made to keep this information from her. This is definitely the Duke's business. So despite the late hour, the protagonist goes to Geoffrey and tries to interrogate him. Despite the man's ability to pretend to be innocent, the young woman is convinced that he is not. Geoffrey has no choice but to admit his guilt. Indeed, he hid the truth from Charlotte for many years, but he sincerely wished that the archmage could live a new carefree life. However, he asks not to apply magic to him at this time, as the young woman would not have been able to do so anyway. The protagonist had no intention of using any powers other than physical ones, and she even managed to beat Duke badly. Geoffrey was forced to provide the young woman a huge stack of papers containing records of everything the mage students had done over those 8 years. Charlotte was truly overwhelmed by the volume of these papers and began to study them. That he was looking for a way to lift the curse on the girl, but she wanted nothing from this man. She sincerely wished to live a new life, not to hide from the problems of the old one. In the morning, Phaedon and the other servants came to see Geoffrey's. The Duke refused to open the door, which caused anxiety, and in the end it was decided to open the door themselves. As it turned out, the gentleman was simply lying on the floor, his head covered with papers. This caused a commotion among the servants, and they decided to interrogate the rascal. To interrogate the rogue, but there was no need to do so, the man was only concerned that the protagonist might. At this point, Charlotte was preparing to leave the Count's house that had become her home, but the maid was surprised. The maid was surprised at the young woman's intention to leave unaccompanied. The archmage intended to find her disciples. According to her own senses, the person she had been many years ago no longer existed. Others should understand that. Should have visited Dan first and put an end to the kidnappings in the city. Charlotte suspected she wouldn't be able to find the group. That she would not find the group in the same place she had been yesterday, but she was wrong, for these mages were afraid of nothing and were planning to kidnap her. Were afraid of nothing and even planned to kidnap the main character right at the door, but an unfamiliar man appeared, who had been watching the archmage for several days, and he struck the attacker. As it turned out, the main character had long noticed this man. Charlotte wanted to find out who was watching her, but did not have time. Almost immediately, other members of her student group rushed to her. The main character hid the stranger behind a corner and pretended to find the unconscious man, trying to offer help. The arrivals quickly took the young woman with them into the building. Now it was a completely situation was different from yesterday. The prisoners were tied up and treated much more brutally, but that was not the most unusual aspect. But the man who was leading the group, everyone called him by his name Dan, but he wasn't really an apprentice magician. The real Dan was asleep, and he was brought along with the hostages. Initially, everyone even thought he was dead, but in fact the young man was just in a deep sleep. A quirk he had possessed since childhood, and there were even attempts to dispose of him as dead, but at such times his sleep was especially sound. However, at such moments his sleep was especially strong, and now the teacher did not hesitate to get closer to the young man and gently stroked his hair, but suddenly he opened his eyes, and the young woman quickly reacted by covering Dan's face with her hat. Covering Dan's face with her hat, she then distanced herself so as not to reveal her identity. Surprisingly, the magician did not get into an argument with the imposters, even when they mentioned the other man using his name. Presumably he had a plan. In the meantime, he was simply assessing the situation. The captives were loaded onto a wagon and sent into the woods. There they were taken to a large cave that served as an underground prison. The pretend magician treated them worse than animals. One of the men begged to be set free, explaining that a sick child was waiting for him at home, and if he did not bring the medicine he had bought, the child might die. The Autumn Tribune remained indifferent, and, irritated by the situation, dragged the man from his cell and began beating him, using all sorts of means to do so. And began beating him, hiding behind the name of the archmage's apprentice, at which point the Real Dan couldn't take it anymore. He burned the chains on his wrists and prepared to fight back.